I'd rather create something that others criticize than create nothing and criticize others.
If you have high quality product behind the bar, it's like a weapon.
It's not about the figures. It's about who those figures are.
The Hospopreneurs Podcast.
I'm going to drink this beer.
Yeah, let's crack them.
With James Henderson.
Hello and welcome to episode 70 of the Hospopreneurs Podcast. Jared Brown joins me for an exciting episode today. He's the current Master Distiller of Sipsmith, a London dry style gin, author of over 30 books and drink historian. He shares wisdom from a career with incredible experiences, so sit back and enjoy. Oh, by the way, he claims during the interview that a very famous person enjoys a cocktail with Sipsmith every day. But I'll let you decide that one for yourself. Hello and welcome to the show, Jared.
Hello, wonderful to be here with you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for joining me. I'm really excited to get into the episode today. As you know, the first question I like to ask is, what is your crazy hospitality story?
I first entered hospitality in 1985, so needless to say, there's a lot of them. But early ones centered around my mentor, Tad Hayashi, vice president of Nikko Hotels, Japan Airlines Hotel Division, got me my first job in hospitality in New York when they opened a hotel there, and my sister worked for Japan Airlines. He was looking for staff. She pointed at me, and I ended up with 5 years of Japanese corporate management culture training, a phenomenal education. But sitting down to dinner with him one evening in a Japanese restaurant in New York, and there was lobster, came out on board, then went back into the kitchen, quickly diced, came back out, same position on the board, but now it was in 2-centimeter cubes. And he scoops up 2 bits from the tail before it gets dumped into this stock pot and says, "Oh, it's good in the soup, but you've got to try it this way too." And I look, and it's still moving.
Right.
And I look at my glass of sake, and I'm thinking, ooh, quick ceviche. Maybe I could pull that off. No, they'll notice that one. You know, it's one of those moments where if you were ever going to become a vegetarian, this was that turning point. So I took it and then quickly raised glass, had everyone toast, and did the in-mouth ceviche for that to get past it.
Love that. How did it go?
It was better than I thought it would be.
Good.
Better than that moment that he dragged me into another New York restaurant, Aregawa Kobe Steakhouse. The hostess speaks no English. The chef comes out to greet him, speaks no English. The waitress speaks no English. I let him order. We have these soba noodles with 2 kilos of caviar on it. And then the second course I'm looking at, and it's like, this is Tornado de Rossini. And he looks at me and he says, "Of course it is. It's a French restaurant." The height of corporate dining in Japan is classic French, cooked by Japanese people. So yet another one of those moments where my conceptions were completely twisted around.
Have you had any other experiences like that where what you're expecting was pulled out from under you?
Okay, we can head down a darker road. Then we're wandering around Chinatown, not with my mentor, but a group of foreign businessmen. And I've got a translator with me. I don't speak the language they speak. The translator says, well, one of them has said he really wants to buy condoms. Mm-hmm. And so we walk into this pharmacy, and it's 2 little old ladies playing mahjong. And I glance and I see the old male pharmacist. I figure that'll be easier. Walk over to him, say, just looking for condoms. And the foreign gentleman walks up, the only English he spoke all night, and he says it very loudly, "Small size, please."
I love that. Obviously an embarrassing experience too.
Hard to have meetings with him the next day.
Definitely. I like that story too. Thank you, Jared. The next question I like to ask is a very different speed to that one, but it's around why you do what you do. I'd like to know on a super macro level why you do what you do.
I do it because I can't not do it. It's something that found me very early on, and I don't know why it happened this way, but age 6, I'm arguing with my mother because the octopus needs to be frozen and thawed to get the proper texture for an octopus vinaigrette, but leave it in the freezer 3 months. I'm sorry, that's just freezer burn. Throw it out. My first cooking lesson that summer was on a mountain in Mexico, learning from the little old ladies how to select the dried ears of corn from the pyramids of corn in the fields, grind those into tortillas, pick ripe limes, harvest wild rocket, arugula, and then we had all the fixings except one, and the caballero arrived with a black goat over his shoulder and showed me, to this day, the most humane dispatch I have ever seen of a creature, and letting its blood return to the soil as per thousands of years of tradition, and then selecting the cuts and grilling it just to make tortillas cabritos. That was my first cooking lesson. It took me 40 years to hunt down the tea that they served that day, but I finally found this particular Mexican té de limon walking down a street in Tequila, Mexico about 10 years ago, and it's a hot summer day in the middle of the street, and suddenly I do a 90-degree turn into a shop. I can smell it. It's there. It's the one I've been hunting for years. I go all the way to the back of the shop and I find a display of boxes of this tea and just scooped a bunch of them straight over to the cashier. Caught up to my friends who had no idea what epiphany I had just been through and what joy. But they say scent memory lasts 20 years. That one lasted 40. So why do I do what I do? I think that's a tip of the iceberg.
Definitely. What I'm trying to get to with this sort of question is a deeper understanding on a really fundamental level. What is it that you're so passionate about that makes you do what you do every day?
To quote, I think it was a 1990s film, early 90s film called Groove, about a rave out of San Francisco. And that question was put to the organizer of this rave by one of the guys working for him, who said, you don't make any money, you risk arrest. Why do you do this? What do you get out of it? And he said, it's the nod. At the end of it, there will be someone who just comes up and they say, hey, thanks. And they nod. And I nod back, and that's it. It's about the nod. It's about this human connection over happiness created through a good experience.
I really like that. That is a fantastic answer.
And I also have an insatiable need to entertain and inform. I admit it.
Many of us do. How about what you do? Let's go down an avenue around what it is on a technical level that you do.
These days, I'm trying to narrow that down a bit. I'm Master Distiller for Sipsmith, the first new gin company out of London in almost 200 years. It seems lately we're credited for being instrumental in starting the gin craze, because back 12 years ago when we were trying to get a license, the Excise Act of 1823 stood firmly in our way. You simply couldn't get a license to start a new small distillery. We got that overturned and got up and running with a lot of media focus. And well, when we started, there were 12 companies in Britain making gin, doing 20 brands of gin. Today, there's something nearing 500 distilleries producing 870 brands of gin, mostly based on our legal work.
Is that actually the case? Sipsmith has overturned the law and then that's driven other gin distillers to come in and build?
Yep, that's how we got started. We couldn't start till we defeated that Gin Act.
What was it that needed to be changed for you guys to come in?
The Act said that if your still was under 18 hectoliters, 1,800 liters, then if your application was turned down, there was no recourse to appeal. Now, every application is turned down first time around. You missed a comma, it's turned down. You missed anything. You think of your first application on it as a rough draft and you're getting feedback. Well, in this case, the feedback was fuck off, you're done. And we pointed out that that law was intended to prevent moonshiners from setting up shop in the early 19th century. And this is the early 21st century. Can we move on? And they provisionally approved us. And they were actually watching our activity very closely to make sure that we weren't moonshining. Up until 2016, the act was finally officially done in. On the basis of us getting that provisional permission, everyone else was able to get the same.
How did you go about negotiating that with the government?
That, thankfully, I was able to turn over to my two business partners, Sam and Fairfax, who both have connections, friends of friends in government. And they were able to work on that while I was able to focus entirely on my end of it, which is the history, the tradition, the heritage. I can recite the Gin Acts, I just can't tell you who to speak to about getting them changed.
Fantastic. On that note, I'd like to open up more of a discussion around the history. You have a background as a gin and cocktail historian.
As a drink historian in general, Anastasia Miller, my wife and business partner, and I have written something like 38 books, including Spiritus Journey, History of Drink, from the earliest archaeological and evidence of intentional fermentation right up to the 20th century, a book that we now need to revise and expand because the earliest archaeological evidence of intentional fermentation was just set back 4,000 years this past September, which to me was absolutely groundbreaking and reaffirming as to something that I've been postulating for years, which is that we moved as a species from hunter-gatherer to agrarian, not to bake bread, but to make beer, to make alcohol. And a Chinese team working under the banner of University of Stanford, studying a semi-nomadic tribe in what is now Israel 13,000 years ago, they were not just making beer, but they were growing wheat and barley and malting the grain. So complex brewing techniques 4,000 years earlier than we believed our species had been making alcohol. But the most important thing in all of that was they were semi-nomadic. Here we were moving from hunter-gatherer to agrarian to make beer, and it is now proven.
So not the agricultural revolution, but the beer revolution.
The birth of civilization.
Yeah.
That was it. Yeah, civilization was born at happy hour.
What's another story that really drives something home for you? A drink story that you find interesting or exciting?
Weirdly, two of my favorite discoveries happened both in the middle of the night. That night, little insomnia, so I rolled over, picked up the laptop, and I was just trawling through the newspaper archives, running same searches that I had before, because there's always new material added to these archives. So I'll go back as a historian and recheck, fish the same spots again. And in this case, the word cocktail came up, 20th of March, 1798, in the London Morning Post and Gazetteer, page 2. And it was talking about what the politicians were drinking in a tavern at the corner of Downing and Whitehall, right in the heart of British politics. Pitt the Younger, whose premiership was marked by the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, and also had really pissed off the newspaper by doubling their price with a tax. The masthead of the paper said, price 3 shillings, taxed by Mr. Pitt 3 shillings as of, total 6 shillings. So they had him drinking huile de vin, parfait amour, and cocktail, vulgarly called ginger. Now, ginger meant a couple of different things at that time. I started digging through every formula book that I could to track that one down. Ended up in a veterinary and found that if your horse had stomach troubles, colic, you would treat it with a bucket of oats, water, gin, and ginger. So here was giving ginger to the horse to help its stomach. Or if you were a horse trader and you wanted to get a good price for a horse, you might ginger it so that this sway-backed nag would have bright eyes, a springlet step, and tail held high. By peeling a bit of ginger, putting it in the right spot on the horse, you'd get that effect till it was off the lot. I'm not sure which one they meant for Pitt, but it was one of the two. And the word cocktail was because when you step out on the street, note how many cars there are. Replace that with horses times about 2. That's how many horses there used to be in a city. Most of them in London at the time were cocktails, tail cut short to market as a horse of mixed breed. They were everywhere, so that's why cocktail. So loved that one.
The joy of mixology, I know Gary Reagan said something quite different. He couldn't seem to find the origin of the word cocktail, and I think he provided a few different examples. That might have been one of them, so I was very interested in your perspective on that, having a history background around this sort of thing. So interesting to hear your perspective on that. I'd like to sort of spur you on with a comment on, you had a website that accidentally took off. You want to tell us a little bit about that one?
Oh, yeah. Actually, it was 1995. My wife and I were living in Vancouver, wrote 6 travel books about Vancouver, reviewed 500 restaurants, stayed in 200 hotels in the course of those 3 years. But while we were there, a friend of ours said, hey, you know this internet? I think it's going to be big. You should get on it. Build a website. And Halloween night, the wife is sat in front of the computer, looks up at me, says, so what should we do a website on? And I was holding 2 martinis. So we put up a martini website, expected it to get a dozen hits. There were 2,500 emails that came in immediately, which back then was more than enough to crash your service provider. We crashed our service provider 4 times in the first month. Within 6 months, this website had turned into a behemoth, and an editor from HarperCollins reached out, said, I love your site. I've been on it since the beginning. I want to turn it into a book. And so we very quickly made a round of the rare book rooms in the public libraries in Vancouver, San Francisco, New York, to get the pieces that we felt were missing from the book and round it out and sent that off. And even though his boss said, wait, a book on martinis? It's a dead subject. No one's going to be interested in it. And it went into 17 printings before the pub date. And today it's still out there going strong at over 500,000 and is the world's best-selling book on the martini. And that's Shaken Not Stirred, a celebration of the martini. Came as a big surprise to MGM UA when, White being a very thorough person, trademarked the phrase shaken not stirred. They'd never used it as a title. And so she just went off and trademarked it. A year later, we got a remarkably terse letter signed by about 20 lawyers over at MGM UA saying, well, we just applied with intent to use that phrase and we were turned down because apparently you've been approved on your trademark within use. And so you'll need to relinquish that immediately. And I didn't bother to go to a lawyer for this, just wrote back. So yeah, we were approved within use. You were turned down with intent to use. What again is your question in law?
Yeah.
Didn't hear back. But long after they forget how they know your name, they remember your name. And another department at MGM rang us up and had us do the martini trivia for the Dr. No DVD.
There you go. There's always another way to get around that sort of thing or work with the law. There's another thing I'd like to bring up is the Queen of England does something every day. You want to tell us a little bit about what she does every day?
Well, she does something that I think is a very good idea. It's a secret to longevity. And the point is, she doesn't normally do it more than once a day, but she does it every day. And that is that she has a dry martini.
Well, obviously with...
Oh, well, she does drink it with Sipsmith, from what I've been told. I've only seen photographic evidence of that once. And just after her Jubilee, for her Jubilee, we sent her a couple of specially labeled bottles of our London Dry in a beautiful gift box. And those gifts you never really expect to make it to Her Majesty, but just into the court. And then a few weeks later, she was being interviewed in her sitting room about something or other. And there on the sideboard, you could see one of the bottles that we'd sent, and it was near gone. So we quickly sent a few more over to her.
That's an amazing surprise.
It was a wonderful honor to see that.
Beautiful. I'd like to know, Jared, what you're learning about or exploring at the moment.
I am in the midst of an epiphany at the moment that will be in my next book. My next book is actually a consumer book called Sip, 100 Gin Cocktails with Only 3 Ingredients. Should be out in August. In it, I just also changed the history of gin. This idea that gin came over from Holland during or after the 30 Years' War, that King William of Orange, in fostering the production of Geneva in 1689 onward, that eventually evolved into this complex London Dry gin. So here I've found formulas from before and during the 30 Years' War in London for a juniper-led and then supported with Spanish orange and lemon peel, and then backed with spices, including cinnamon, etc. This is my London Dry recipe from a century and a half before it should exist. And there it is. It was written in code, which it took me a while to crack the cipher, but it was a guild book, and the guilds didn't want their recipes falling into the hands of the uninitiate. So it was code, but once the code was cracked, there is no question what this recipe is, and that's that it's proof that they were already making this style of gin before the Dutch influence. And in fact, the Dutch influence took them away from it for a bit, and then it didn't evolve from Geneva. They came back to it after the Geneva fad burned out. So that's one that I'm having an awful lot of fun with at the moment.
Wonderful. I'm looking forward to reading that in your book as well. What innovations or innovative techniques have you seen in the industry?
Oh, I think the biggest innovative trend is toward localization or toward reaching back to old techniques. And this to me is fascinating. We're back to fingers in the soil. We're back to garden to glass. We're back to localization that is wonderful on a planet where you can now have the same rum and coke in every bar, in every city, in every country in the world. And so that I'm dearly loving, and this restraint of following seasonality to find the best individual and local experience. That said, it's great to see everybody jumping on to sous vides and vacuum stills and carbonating shakers, but not just embracing them for the sake of their existence, but there's a maturing of this trend, and that's that people are now figuring out exactly where and when to use these.
This pendulum tends to swing. It's gone too far on the scientific end that they lose touch with the emotional side of the craft, and then can swing back too. So it can become too emotionally driven, too around locality and sustainability and those sorts of concepts. I'm going to say that controversially.
Oh, I agree.
Then it can come back, and you're saying it's maturing, it's settling on this sort of middle point where the pendulum is swinging back to normal. And I wonder whether it's going to go the other way and whether it's cyclical.
It's not so much cyclical as spiral, because we inevitably build on the shoulders of our predecessors. And so we're not just going around to where it was, but we're inevitably going around to a higher level upon what was. And that, to me, is the beauty of what's taking place now, where everyone has been reaching back and studying the past and learning from the past. Because if we didn't do that, the best we could hope for is to stand next to the predecessors. But people are really going out there, learning, and standing on the shoulders of giants.
So for those listening, that's a quote by Isaac Newton. Is that something that you take on board and that you follow personally as well?
I will forever be a student. I read the newspaper for an hour or two daily. I don't care if it's from the 1700s, the 1800s, the 1900s, but I will make a concerted effort to read. I've read the Straits Times from Singapore, every reference to drink from 1860 to present day. That was just because I really wanted to understand what they were drinking, not just to understand the Singapore sling, but to understand other drinks like the very poorly named gin fight, spelled P-A-H-I-T, but it was essentially 50 mils of gin, 25 mils of Angostura bitters. Yeah.
Is that it?
Sounds like a major pinkers, but
That does sound like a fight.
then you dig further and you discover it wasn't Siegert's Angostura bitters that we're all familiar with. It was the Wies Angostura bitters from Amsterdam, which is a much more dilute bitters and balances beautifully at those measures. But it's a bit like when bartenders started to rediscover the gin Ricky, that wonderful drink with gin, soda water, and the juice of half a lime. A terrible drink, rips the enamel off your teeth until you discover that in the 1890s in Washington, D.C., where Colonel Joe Rickey gave birth to that drink, they didn't have Persian limes. They had little tiny Mexican limes, little tiny key limes. So the accurate measure is not a half a lime, but it's 2 lime wedges from a Persian lime is equal to the half a lime that they had. And suddenly it's a gorgeous balanced drink. So yes, you have to dig and you have to keep digging.
Back to innovations. One last question on innovations. What changes do you want to see take place in the industry?
I think the changes that I'm seeing taking place already are the changes that I wanted to see, from little things like vermouth being routinely refrigerated to bartenders taking good care of themselves and realizing that if you want to be in this for the long run, it can't be the mad party every night without some survival technique beyond that, to a rise in consumer sophistication, which is something that I've been desperate to see. Well, there's a million changes, and thankfully I'm seeing so many of them going ahead. Another, a universal understanding when you're creating a drink. You just have to ask one question before you can say that it's done, and that's, is it good? Which means, is the satiation level below the bottom of the bowl of the glass? Does it seem like a good idea to have just one more? I'm glad to see bartenders are not straw tasting drinks as much these days, especially not when they're doing development, because tasting with a straw isolates the flavor to your mouth away from the nose, unless you're putting straws in your nose, in which case we need to have an intervention anyway.
The quote there that I've really, I mean, there were so many things that you just said there, but one that's really resonated is the satiation level. Is the satiation level lower than the bottom of the glass? That's definitely going to be a favorite of mine.
The way that you test that is you have 3 of your own drink, because you want your consumers to have 3. So before you consider a drink is done for a menu or for a competition, take an evening, sit down, have 3.
Why 3?
Well, people go out and they have 3 martinis on an evening. They'll have 3 Manhattans. They'll have 3 daiquiris. They'll have 3 margaritas over the course of an evening. And if they walk in and a bartender's got a great new experimental drink, here's the litmus test. Does that person sit down and have 3? Or at the bottom of the first one, do they say, wow, that was interesting? Can I have a beer? That means the satiation point was in the middle of the glass. That means you've done them in. So that's why I test it with 3, because if you can drink 3, by the bottom of the second, you'll know you've got a success, or you'll know what you need to fix, but you won't figure it out with a straw taste.
Why not 2 or 4 or 5 or...
Well, because 2's not enough and 4 is too many.
So 3 is just right. Goldilocks.
That's it.
Jared, I'd really like to ask you how you get into a creative state to develop ideas.
This is a wonderful question. How do you reach a proper creative state for developing ideas? And I will tell you my secret. I wake up. Quite literally, I will be asleep. I wake up and hit immediately. Half the time I will have already started in that transition from dream state to being awake. I've woken the wife up too many times with, oh, honey, you've got to taste this. I just dreamt this drink, or in this transition. It's going to sound a bit new age, etc., but I've done a lot of years of meditation training. And the one thing that comes out of that is this idea of mindfulness, of waking and being conscious of the process of waking. And I find in that moment phenomenal clarity when I'm still not attached to my body, but I'm conscious. And there was one night I hit that state middle of the night, and it dawned on me why doctors were wearing plague masks full of juniper, and why people were garlanding their homes with juniper during the plagues, and eating juniper. It entered European cuisine during the plagues. And I just rolled over and Googled for confirmation of what I realized was going to be there. I Googled juniper, flea repellent. Hundreds of naturopathic sites selling juniper as a great flea repellent, and somehow no one had ever connected that one. So there, perhaps not the creative side you were looking for, but in terms of prolific writing, I have 2 ways that I got over writer's block. First was that moment when I knew that I had the choice of reaching my deadline on time or being homeless.
You're hungry.
Suddenly it wasn't hard. And the other was childhood memories. Age 5, my father paralyzed by motor neuron disease, except his eyes. That was all he could move at that point. And the nurse would hold up a piece of paper drawn into quadrants with letters in upper right, upper left, lower right, lower left. And he would look up, down, left, right. She'd go on to the next page with fewer letters until she could guess which letter he was after. And he wrote not just half of his second book, which would be his last book that way. He wrote me a 37,000 word letter for later in life. For that reason, I never allow myself the vanity of writer's block, the vanity of not being able to sit down and having an outpouring of creativity. He was also a painter. I just recently started painting again, and my wife said, oh, by the way, I've been in touch with a gallery. I want to get your work shown. And I said, what do you mean shown? There's barely anything up there. And she said, I counted 60 odd canvases that you've finished in the last 3 months. Oh, I missed those. So creativity, look around, find whichever mode of expression is inspiring you at that moment. And don't try to track down one that you're beating your head against the wall with. Walk away, come back, let it well up inside you till it's full to bursting. If you're sitting down to write an article and the middle part is just there, or the end is right there in mind, for me at least, I'll just start there and write it down and then come back to the beginning.
And that there summarizes to me, strike while the iron's hot.
Yeah.
You should do what comes easiest at that time and don't force something that isn't happening. And it's definitely something that I like to explore through the show is different creative mediums, and the hospitality industry, and I say that very broadly, is one avenue to express ourselves through drinks or food. And it's a magical mode of expression because it engages all five senses. There's no other creative outlet.
But it is so much more. It is so much more than drink or food, because no one goes to a bar for a drink. Put two bakeries side by side. One bakery selling bread for $3, the other selling that bread for $2. One's out of business in a year. Put a liquor store, an off-license, next to a bar. One's selling a bottle for $75, the other's selling a bottle for $250. 10 years later, they're both still thriving. Why? Because anyone who just wanted to drink bought a bottle and went home. People who went in the bar went in for the experience. They go into a bar, in the words of Gaz Regan, in the hope that they will leave feeling better than when they came in. And that is what the bartender does. And making a great drink is one of the created processes that shapes that effect. Making the menu, creating the venue space, but most important of all, the role the bartender plays, stepping up on stage every evening. And it is a stage. Every bar is a stage, and all the bartenders are actors on that stage. The only difference is you can make it to Broadway as an actor, and they still don't tip you.
This is true. This is true. We could almost paraphrase some Shakespeare in that as well. It's almost a Shakespeare
You caught
quote.
the reference.
I did,
I
yeah.
was sliding that in under there.
Yeah,
I wasn't going to
saw that.
say men and women merely players.
Yes, I hope that some listeners have understood that same one as well. I want to touch on there maybe around the customer experience a little bit more, and what you believe can really drive the most incredible customer experience. Because just to elaborate on what you said there, I think about it as when someone walks in the door, they're not outrightly saying this, but they are saying, give me a good time. And as you said there, Gary Regan said something similar, like they want to leave happier than when they arrived. I think it's very similar that they're saying, give me a good time, and it's your job as a hospitality professional to identify what a good time means to every individual and then deliver that to the best of your ability with the tools you have at your disposal, you know, whether it's behind the bar or in the kitchen or seating, lighting, whatever it is. So I'd like to hear your perspective on what constitutes an incredible experience.
There are two, and they happen at the beginning and at the finish of the experience. And they are both the same thing, and that is eye contact, connection, the smile, the welcome on arrival. Because when you walk into a bar, if it's a place you've been a bunch of times, you'll have a longer duration before you hit the feeling of alienation. But when you walk into a strange bar, you walk in already with complete alienation. You are a stranger in a strange land, and you won't feel welcome until you are welcomed. It's 3 deep at the bar. The bartender glances up, just shoots you a quick smile, a nod. That's it. You've been acknowledged. You know that you will eventually be properly greeted, that you'll have service. That is a huge transition to the guest, and it takes no effort at all for the bartender. So that begins that experience, that feeling better. Then when it's all over, there has to be that same acknowledgement, the nod, the wave, the thank you. And that closes it and lets them know that the next time they come back, that feeling of being a stranger in a strange land will be lessened. And it's lessened by that. So we've just talked about really the fundamentals of a bar experience without even mentioning a drink.
Yeah. Again, what I try to do through this program is to share with people philosophical concepts and sociological and anthropological ideas, because that's really what life is about. It's actually a show on life. It's not a show just on hospitality. You know, it's about people and everything that we do. This is the industry that I've found that involves people the most. It is so human centric. This is what we do. So in order to do a great job, we need to understand people the best, because we provide service. Because a lot of what we actually do is connect with individuals and give people a good time. And what that good time is constituted by depends on the individual, and that we have to identify that. So there's so many variables at play. And that's why I love discussing these sorts of ideas. I can see you're ready to say something there.
Oh, no, but you're absolutely right. And that's what makes the difference between a sports bar and a very posh opulent space and a pickup joint is that we create the different experience within a space. My wife and I and a business partner had a nightclub in New York years ago, 750 capacity, but it was spread over 4 floors. And we used that opportunity to create different experiences within the different spaces. And it was fascinating watching how people would gravitate to one or the other of these spaces, from the cellar bar, which was strictly whiskey and beers, but we flavor matched them. And if somebody wanted to go beyond the Boilermaker into a depth charge and drop that whiskey into their beer, we had the back bar duplicated in a glass front freezer under it. So all the whiskeys were also frozen, and there were frozen shot glasses, so that shot of whiskey wouldn't warm your beer. And then a couple of pool tables and a humidor. And that was one bar. Next was a big thumping nightclub space with bottle service, but took the bottle service to a different level by giving, rather than vodka with a bunch of juices so that you can make all the worst drinks of the 70s. Yeah, you can have a sea breeze, a bay breeze, a madras, a Cape Cod, or a screwdriver. Seems to be my experience with bottle service now. We offered like a house-made ginger beer with fresh limes and a bucket of ice spheres if you wanted to make Queen Mary cocktails, or these days they call them Moscow Mules since they switched it over to vodka later on. But though the original was gin, ginger beer, and limes, and was the signature drink on the Queen Mary. So we did that in the nightclub space. And then upstairs was New York branch of the Museum of the American Cocktail. I created one with Dale DeGroff and his wife years ago, and had guest bartenders coming in doing limited shifts. And then up above that, a mezzanine that was just a drinks trolley and an understanding you were there solely to experience whatever that bartender wanted to make you at that moment. And guests who made it up there were told the only word you can say to the bartender at this point is yes. Anything else, and why are you sitting up there? You're turfed out.
I like that too.
4 very different experiences.
How can someone learn to engineer those environments for guests?
Go out, experience as many as you can, and take it. Don't ever think you're going to remember fine details the morning after the night before. Alcohol always convinces us we'll remember it, but if you get into writing or even voice memoing or tons of photos, obsessively Instagramming, if only for your own gratification, those captures of the moment in time will prove invaluable toward your studies. And I still study. I know you still study. Everyone should. And that's how we can build our knowledge base on that.
What's your biggest challenge right now, Jared?
Jet lag. Definitely jet lag, because as soon as I've gotten used to the time zone here, I'm going to be back in England and trying to get a couple of 100 plants wedged into the garden very quickly, though I'll probably be better off if there's moonlight, because I'm going to be dead asleep during the day. Other biggest challenge is enough hours, enough time. There's so much I'd like to be doing all at once. If only they'd mastered human cloning when I was born, and I could have like a team of 4 or 5 of me, I could come close to doing what I'd like to be doing right now, because I look out the window of this hotel and I see the aquarium down there and this Australian wildlife experience, and I'd like to be wandering through learning in there. And to be honest, the closest I've seen to wildlife was an episode of Skippy the Bush Kangaroo.
Well, I hope you do get to see more Australian wildlife. I guess jet lag's a more urgent challenge, and we all struggle with the same 24 hours in the day. It's around how we use them. How are you going about then dealing with that challenge?
I'm not. I haven't. For the most part, I've utterly abdicated responsibility. God, I hope the wife won't hear this, but Anastasia has my email address on her computer as well. And when emails get panicky, she flags them up on WhatsApp to me. And so before I read my emails, I read WhatsApp from her. And she's already inadvertently prioritized everything of saying, you've really got to get on this. They need an answer immediately, or you really need to sit down and write. That's got to be dealt with. It's been a wonderful role reversal, because for 5 or 6 years, I worked as not her personal assistant, because she had one of those as creative director of a big marketing firm, but as sort of assistant to her and her assistant.
Or the road I'm trying to go down with this question is it's not necessarily around jet lag or struggling with hours in the day, because we all got those problems of not enough sleep and hours. But what I'm sort of trying to get to is, are you solving those problems by building something that other people can get behind? It sounds like that's something that you've done as well. You've been able to build concepts that then have inspired other people. And building a business, for example, is a way to do that, to inspire people behind a cause or a concept that then you can get those things done. Not all of them, they're infinite, right? But you can create more, you can build more, you can grow more if you can inspire other people to get behind the same cause. And that's ultimately what building a business is.
This has been really strange and disconcerting for me. When we started Sipsmith, it was 3 of us in a West London garage. Export was anything outside London. Distribution was Sam's Moped. All did all jobs. I think for the first 5 years, I was the company photographer as well as master distiller. In addition to, we did have a PR company, but I was doing a lot of the PR work, education, on trade, off, etc. Now, 63 core people in the office, 70 odd with our international people and regional people. And so instead of me doing the photography, we've got a photographer in-house and a couple of designers who will do, I was also doing the design work at the time, not our label. We had a great local artist do that, but small design projects, I'd pick those up in an instant. And it's really strange for me to have other people taking all of these on. And when they do, there's enough work to keep them busy full time. So I can't exactly wade back in because I can't do it full time. And so, this transition's bizarre to me. And I will admit that sometimes when I feel that frustration well up, I'll take it out by grabbing my camera when I've got an hour off, head into my garden and do some shooting.
The analogy I use is letting go of the wheel. Like you're driving this vehicle, and then for something to truly grow, you have to learn how to slowly let go and step back and let it drive itself. And having a team of people around you that you can rely on, that you can trust to complete the tasks that you want completed to a satisfactory level, to the level that you are happy with, that's the point that you need to get to. And you need to step back and be able to allow it to drive itself. And that's a really hard time. A lot of people struggle with that and end up being too involved or micromanaging or have other sorts of struggles in the process. So that's obviously something that you've just described, that transition has taken place and will continue to take place as the brand grows as well. So that's a really exciting time. So thank you for sharing that too. I only have a couple more questions for you, Jared. I'd like to ask, where do you ultimately want to be?
Ultimately, I'm not just answering this physically, but more spiritually. And the place that I most want to be is to be here now, is to be in the present. And that to me is more important than anything else, is not to find myself miles away, but to make sure that I'm doing something that I want to do, to the point where I just want to be here now. And certainly speaking with you is wonderful. It's enjoyable. It's such a pleasure that, I'm very happy being here right now.
Thank you.
I've met a number of lawyers and accountants, people who went out and got that degree that was going to impress mom and dad. And then eventually it's hit them. They didn't want to be here now, and they've moved into hospitality because I believe there is a much higher satisfaction level potential within hospitality to be able to love what you do. And it's a very broad field, but it's a very rewarding field.
Well, that's exactly what I did. But I'd identified that long before I'd worked in the finance world for, decades. So I was finishing my degree, and during that process, I started a tech company that ended up failing a couple of years later. I was lost, went on a holiday. Listeners will know this story, but went on a holiday to Melbourne, the hospitality mecca of Australia, in my opinion, still is. And I decided that I wanted to stay in the industry when I was down there. Started this show out of the process and haven't looked back since. And I've remained in the industry and worked everywhere, all sorts of places since. So that totally resonates. I think that there's so much satisfaction people can get out of working in hospitality. It teaches you so many incredible things. And I think one of the most important things that people don't really get for a while, even very experienced bartenders, or not just bartenders, but hospitality professionals, something that I think a lot of people really struggle with until they're very experienced experienced is the idea of removing ego from anything that they do. And sometimes you have to take a step back in order to step forward. Sometimes stepping sideways isn't down or up or whatever. Sometimes you got to mop up things that you don't want to have to mop up, or, pick up glasses or wash things or tidy up.
Oh, absolutely.
Doesn't matter.
I can't tell you how guilty I feel when I show up to a place and I do a guest shift, and it ends up being a bit of a ballerina shift where I just get to ponce about while somebody else does all the heavy lifting. I'm always happy to do the washing up. I don't feel a drink is made until you've rinsed ends and put them back clean and checked your station and made sure everything is back in original position. I think that is so essential in drink making, but in a broader sense, in every step we take in every day.
One last question for you, Jared. I'd love to know who you'd like to hear on the show next.
Wow, I've just gotten a absolute flood of names coming to mind. Gary Regan, just because he's always such fun to speak to. Over to Angus Winchester, who was former global brand ambassador of Tanqueray. Great fun. Have you spoken to Ian Burrell? He's global rum ambassador and was actually a rap star before he got into the business and is just phenomenal. Though, incidentally, he and I always get mistaken for each other, which is so funny. I've had so many people walk up to me and say, I know you, you're Ian Burrell. Or to him, and they call him Jared Brown plenty of times. There's a driver in Cuba who's driven the two of us around Havana for years, and our last morning there this past year, the driver looks at us in the mirror and says, I always get this wrong, guys. Points to Ian and says, now you're Jared Brown and you're Ian Burrell. And I said, no, Ian's just got a goatee and I've got full beard. So you can just clock that. Also, Ian wears a hat more than I do. Plus he's 6'3" and black from Jamaica. But yeah, we're always mixed up. And I think it's because overwhelming personalities that are similar will completely step to the fore over skin color.
100%. Some things just transcend everything else.
Yeah.
On that, I want to thank you very much for being on the show today, Jared. It's been amazing having you on. Been a really interesting and exciting, insightful chat, and I'm looking forward to staying connected.
Love it. Thanks so much. And to everyone out there, cheers.
Thank you.
The show today was produced by the in-house audio team at Hospopreneurs, led by Jake Olver. Voiceovers were by Angus Brennan. To learn more, head to hospopreneurs.com.